Okay. Well, thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be invited to speak at this prestigious event. It really is an honor for me, and I want to acknowledge and thank Professor Anton Straw for your kind words of introduction. I really appreciate that, and acknowledge Professor Sunil Maharaj, Dean Faculty for Engineering in the Built Environment, and also Dr. Truman Gorbat, President of the South African Academy for Engineering. And all our special guests from the university and from business, thank you. I'm very grateful to be able to speak to you today, but also pleased that I can build on the legacy that was established by our founder. Dr. Albert Wessels was the founder of Toyota South Africa, and I note that he was also one of the speakers at this event in 1981. So it's nice to be able to continue with that legacy. As you heard from Professor Straw, I have an industry role leading NAAMSA, which is the sector body. So today I'm going to talk from an industry perspective, but of course I'm also going to intertwine that with a number of views and perspectives and some practical aspects from Toyota as well. I think if we consider where we are as a country and the time that we are at with the low levels of consumer and business confidence, it's important that we do discuss, can we grow industrialization in South Africa, and what concrete steps can we take to do that? And so I'd like to present a story that will take us through some discussions, first of all around the background of the automotive industry globally, because as a South African automotive industry, we are inextricably intertwined with the global supply chain. And then I'll lead into discussions around where we are as a country in terms of industrialization, and then feed that through to the South African automotive industry, and then some concrete discussions around challenges and opportunities going forward. So first of all, in terms of the automotive industry and in terms of manufacturing globally, of course, today's economies are changing quite dramatically, triggered by developments in emerging markets, the accelerated rise of new technology. We have a number of sustainability policies that are being introduced, and of course there's also changing customer preferences and choices, especially around ownership. Digitization, increased automation levels, and new business models are really revolutionizing business. And of course the automotive industry is not exempt from that. If we think of the automotive industry, we think of four main disruptors that have been developing just over the last 8 years, as you can see. They are the connectedness of vehicles, the move towards autonomous vehicles, shared services, and electrification. In fact, if I can quote the president of Toyota Motor Corporation, who heads up Toyota globally, he says that we are currently experiencing a once-in-a-century change for the automotive industry. So that's a very significant and dramatic statement to make. If we consider all of the developments and enhancements and innovation that we've all experienced in our lifetime, he's in fact saying that that's more significant, and it's a once-in-a-century change. So that's the backdrop that we have to consider. If we now think a little bit about the automotive industry globally, and we look at the global production rankings around the world. Of course, China is the largest manufacturer of vehicles globally. That's followed by United States, then Germany, United States, Japan, then Germany, and quite interestingly, India, which is a developing market, has now moved up into fifth position. On the other hand, you can see on the chart the motorization levels. So this is the ownership of vehicles per capita. In developed markets, the ownership levels are extremely high, between 450, 500 to 800 units per capita. However, that is changing significantly. Younger people in the developed markets have less of an inclination towards buying vehicles, and those motorization levels are already on the decline. However, in the developing markets, there's a tremendous potential. And if we look at Africa, with a motorization level of only 44, it's acknowledged by all brands globally that Africa will become the fastest growing motor vehicle market in the world. And you can see the potential and the importance of vehicles as a driver for economic opportunities is really significant. The only debate we have, and I'll touch on this a bit later, is when. But we know that Africa has a population of over 1.3 billion. We know there's tremendous infrastructure development, that economies are growing at very high GDP rates, and that over time we're going to see a big demand for vehicle purchases. Of course, we can't have a discussion like this without talking about Fourth Industrial Revolution, or Industry 4.0, and of course the automotive industry fits very nicely in that second step when mass production started in the 1870s, and vehicles then start to become manufactured at high production volumes. The automation flow that led in the third industrial revolution obviously had a big impact in being able to provide affordability to customers. And today we're talking about Industry 4.0 and the massive impact that's going to have on us. So to put that in a little bit of context, I want to talk first of all about manufacturing as a whole. So there are 6 elements that relate to how that's going to impact on us in manufacturing. And some of these may be very familiar to you, some of these may be new. The first one is that mass manufacturing versus global manufacturing. Mass customization, rather, versus global manufacturing. Now that's a little bit counterintuitive to many of us. We've been focusing on long production runs, low levels of diversification to ensure the economies of scale. But the Fourth Industrial Revolution says we need to look at mass customization and to do that really efficiently. And that's going to change our world and is already changing our world. The growth of additive manufacturing, of course, 3D printing being a good example to that. How's that going to speed up research and development, prototyping, etc. The next one is the use of advanced materials and composites. Motor industry is very familiar with high tensile steels, aluminium, composites, but there are more dramatic changes coming our way that are going to change the way we manufacture and the way we add value in our products. Big data, artificial intelligence, and robotics, of course, is going to have a big impact on predictive maintenance, on the amount of data that we need to analyze and store and manage. The next one is the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. So we often, from an engineering point of view, or almost a market point of view, want to target the early adopters. We want to bring in the latest technology. But from an economic point of view, we should not lose sight of making sure that we provide affordable solutions. And certainly in Africa, that's going to be very important to us. And the last one is the Internet of Things. How are we going to change how markets operate, how products are consumed, where they're made, and there's going to be a big impact on the value chain itself. So let's talk about the automotive industry. That was the manufacturing sector. There's going to be big changes, and we like to talk about this using the acronym of CASE. And I'll refer to that a little bit earlier. The first one is connected vehicles. And there's a tremendous opportunity for vehicles in the future to be connected to infrastructure, connected to other vehicles. We tend to think of connected vehicles as connecting us as passengers or drivers to the vehicle, but that's really just the start of it. And as an example, as Toyota South Africa, we have just announced a couple of world firsts where we have introduced connected devices in all our Toyota and Lexus vehicles from the 1st of September. So all our vehicles will get a telematics device, obviously GPS accelerometers, but also a Wi-Fi hotspot preloaded with data. And this is just the start of how we can collaborate with different industries to provide unique solutions. It's a first. We're doing it here in South Africa, not in other developed markets. Nobody else has done this. And so it just shows what really is possible. The second one is autonomous vehicles. And of course, I could go into more detail, but I'd just like to make the simple point that autonomous vehicles is not only about driverless vehicles. It's actually about safety. It's about reducing accidents, injuries on the road. It can be very simply thought of in 5 different stages. And the first 3 stages are really about the introduction of safety technology that steps in the event that the driver did not respond quickly or did not realize that there was an impending danger. And I think my practical comment, to be quite brief, is that we should be focusing a lot more on those technology introductions and focusing less on considering whether the vehicle itself will be driverless. And if we're quite honest with ourselves in South Africa and Africa, the quality of our infrastructure is going to take a long time before we get to the point of actual driverless vehicles. The third one is around mobility financing, and this is around the concept that vehicles themselves are not well utilized. We park them for large periods of the day, and is there a way of structuring the utilization of vehicles in a completely different way? We need connected vehicles to be able to drive and facilitate autonomous and mobility financing. And the last one is around electrification. Again, we tend to think from an electrification point of view of battery electric vehicles, but that's not the whole story. We need to think of the different technologies actually being more or less suited to different usage conditions. And so certainly as a company, we're very focused on looking at hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, and battery electric vehicles as an area that we need to look at quite aggressively. Toyota's made the announcement globally that by 2030, they will be selling 5.5 million electrified vehicles a year. That's an enormous number, of which 4.5 million will be hybrid, and 1 million will be fuel cell or battery electric vehicles. So that's a ratio of 1:4.5. I believe that in the African continent, that ratio will be closer to 1:10. We're going to see a proliferation of hybrid vehicles. And just to give you a small understanding of how that's going to change in Africa, we have a significant challenge with used cars being imported into Africa. Most of those used cars come from Japan as a right-hand drive vehicle into the east coast of Africa. About 60% of all vehicles sold in Japan are hybrids. So what vehicles are going to be sold in Africa in 5 to 7 years' time? Hybrid. And we need to gear up for that and understand the impact it's going to have on the entire value chain. So let's talk a little bit about the macroeconomics of deindustrialization or slow industrialization. I'm certainly not going to try and have an academic discussion about which one is true, but I'd like to just give you a little bit of data. First of all, if we look at manufacturing and its contribution to GDP, we're at a fairly low level of 11.8%. And if we look at over the last 10 years, that's been fairly stable at more or less that number. The average for developing markets is around 20%. So we are way behind. And the theory is that for developing markets, we need to generate industrialization before we move into a developed economy and start to stimulate and grow the services sector. Unfortunately, we haven't fully developed as an industry the industrialization, and so it would be disadvantageous to move into growing the services industry too early. But unfortunately, that is what we've already done. If we look from 1980 all the way through to the 2010s, the portion of industry, which includes mining, transport, construction, obviously manufacturing, it's dropped from 44% all the way down to 29%. And the services sector, utilities, not utilities, transport, financial services, trade, has actually grown, and the employment in that area has also grown. So if we use the definition that this deindustrialization refers to the level that industry contributes to the economy and the fact that that's declining, then yes, we do have deindustrialization in South Africa. Of course, government understands and realizes that there's a big need for industrialization. They created the Industrial Policy Action Plan as early as 2008. There's been a number of updates to that, and there's a clear recognition that we need to look at beneficiating materials and the resources we have in South Africa, and we also need to look at driving local content to develop the skills and the value addition in our country. So let me talk a little bit about the South African automotive industry and our response to that. So a brief history. We started in the 1920s with manufacturing, largely in the Eastern Cape. This was then followed in the 1960s when a government developed an industrialization or automotive policy. There was incentives. Those incentives were driven by weight, and so you had a lot of casting, forging, metal pressings that grew, and that provided a very good foundation for the automotive industry. In 1995, there was a very big change. We introduced the Motor Industry Development Program, the MIDP, and there was a big drive to make our vehicles competitive so that we could export and start to participate in the global supply chains. And that was very successful. However, it was not WTO compliant. And so in 2013, government with industry introduced the APDP program, the Automotive Production and Development Program, that was market neutral and drove the support of the competitiveness of the export vehicles. We can think a little bit of the automotive industry from the perspective of NAAMSA, as I mentioned. It's an industry body that tries to coordinate and drive the interests of the manufacturers and the importers. We have 7 original equipment manufacturers in South Africa. 3 of them are based up here in Gauteng. Toyota is based down in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And of course you have Mercedes-Benz, VW and Isuzu in the Eastern Cape. And then there are a large number of importers that import directly into the country. So what is our contribution in South Africa, and how can we make an impact? As an automotive industry, we contribute 6.9% of the total GDP of South Africa. That's made up of around 4.2% manufacturing and the remainder on the retail side. We can see that that's a very large portion of total manufacturing. If you strip out the retail element from a GDP point of view, automotive manufacturing is around 30% of total manufacturing contribution in South Africa. And of course, we do know that there's a direct link between manufacturing and unemployment. And unfortunately, in South Africa, the total manufacturing GDP contribution hasn't changed, and we've seen an increase in unemployment, unfortunately. The second one is balance of payment. And we've made a lot of strides together with the APDP program to look at how we can localize. And we're very fortunate now that we have a significant positive impact on the balance of trade as a country. And that's very, very important for us, around 16.8 billion positive. And over the next 5 years, that's going to dramatically improve. On the other hand, the automotive industry is also an important employer. We have around 30,000 in the OEM, the 7 OEMs, further 83,000 in our direct suppliers, and then the rest are in the retail and trade portion, making up around 470,000 direct employed. If we then look at the indirect and all the other associated businesses that are connected with the automotive industry, that then moves to 1.4 million people. So it's a very important employer in the country. And of course, these skills, and I'll refer to that a little bit later, are highly skilled people as well. Transformation is key, and we are making good progress in terms of the transformation of our supply base, the OEMs, and our retail businesses, and putting a lot of funds into skills development and training. Fortunately, since the introduction of the APDP program, a lot of investment has gone into the country. And since 1995, there's around 39 billion rand investment. If we then look, that's only from the 7 OEMs, if we then look at our supply base as well, between 18 and 20 additional billion rand has gone into driving our economy. There's been a big change to the way we are thinking about the future as an automotive industry. I referred earlier to the fact that MIDP was the industrial policy which worked from 1995 to 2012. We then had the APDP program, and I really consider it one of the highlights of my career, being able to negotiate and finalize a vision all the way through to 2035 in November of 2018. So we have a clear agreement between industry, the suppliers, the OEMs, and labor of what is our vision. What is the direction we're going to take? What are we wanting to achieve? And how are we going to get there? In the past, we had a lot of focus just on the industrial policy instruments. Now the industrial policy instruments just make up one of those legs of the total plan going forward. We refer to that as the South African Master Plan. We have some big aspirational targets, and certainly want to make a very big contribution in South Africa and also Africa. The aspirational targets are quite significant, and you might think that 2035 is a long way away. Well, for many of us, it's one or maybe only two model life cycles. And each life cycle always represents a step change in our business. And we needed that level of consistency and continuity to be able to support that. From a production point of view, we want to achieve a 1% of global production. We're currently at 0.6%, so only 600,000. For us to achieve that, we would increase our volumes to 1.4 million vehicles a year. We want to double employment, which is certainly a big challenge for us. And we want to be competitive and transform our local supply base as well. We've identified 6 key pillars. On the left-hand side is the optimization of the domestic market. So in South Africa, there's quite a big tax burden on buying a vehicle. You may be quite shocked to know that, on average, 43% of the price you pay on a vehicle is tax. So we're a heavily taxed industry, and we need to find some ways of optimizing that tax, because access to motorization and mobility is a key component for us to transform our country. Secondly, one is around regional development. I talked earlier about the importance of looking at Africa as a tremendous business opportunity. And just earlier this week, or earlier last week, sorry, we also made an announcement as Toyota that we're going to be supplying Kenya with KD kits. So we're looking quite aggressively at a hub and spoke environment in Africa, whereby regionally we look at how we can support African countries to industrialize, to set up motor industry manufacturing opportunities, but also to supply parts in a hub and spoke environment that can benefit everyone. And so we're all looking at how we can play a bigger role in Africa, and the volumes through to 2035 are largely going to be reliant on what we can export. We already export 60% of our total volume, and that's going to climb significantly. So as an industry, we are very focused on being globally competitive to be able to do that. We can easily measure ourselves against other affiliates in other countries and can easily understand where those gaps are. Not focus on competitiveness in South Africa, on exports, which will obviously have a direct impact and benefit for customers in South Africa as well. Localization is the third pillar, and that's a key aspect, because the more we can localize, the more jobs, skills, business opportunities. And without the volume and the localization, we won't be able to transform the industry. And so we're looking at doubling the number of Tier 2 and 3 locally owned suppliers in South Africa, and creating an enormous number of jobs. Infrastructure is a key issue for us. I won't go into too much detail, but everything from fuel quality to port capacity, efficiencies, rails, and road is going to be imperative if we're going to achieve these aspirational targets, along with technology and the skills development that needs to support that. So let's talk a little bit about how we're going to realize this target. First of all, beginning of last year, after President Ramaphosa's Tumamina State of the Nation address, Dr. Johan van Zyl and Rolf Meyer got together to discuss how can they develop a mechanism where business and government can work a lot more proactively together to drive our country forward. And so this initiative has been very interesting. As an auto industry, we were one of the pilots along with agriculture, and it was fascinating to see how many of the other segments are not well coordinated, don't have a 5-year business plan. We often hear about long lists of requests for government or long lists of complaints, but do we actually have a plan of how we're going to contribute and what we're going to do? And I think this has been a very, very useful process for us. And through that, we've developed as an automotive industry a 5-year plan. Of course, the master plan takes us to 2035, but more concretely, what are we going to do just in the next 5 years? So if we think about the automotive industry, we need to think about the component side, the OEMs, and then the retail side. From a component point of view, we have a structure where tier 1 suppliers are directly supplying into the production environment or assembly environment. They largely have technical agreements or license agreements with other companies globally that are responsible for the R&D and the design of those components. We then have tier 2 and 3 suppliers, which are largely locally owned and driven suppliers, much lower cost infrastructure, and that's where the employment and the transformation opportunity is enormous. If we compare ourselves to a country like Thailand, we have a very weak tier 2 and 3 supply base. And so that's where our focus is, on localizing and growing those business opportunities. From an OEM point of view, we need to look at bringing in new technology and obviously addressing the challenges we face from an Industry 4.0 point of view. And from a dealer and retail point of view, from a transformation point of view, how do we uplift the informal sector and integrate that into our more formal structures? And so we have committed, and we have firm and fixed plans as a minimum over the next 5 years to invest 40 billion rand, and our suppliers are going to invest somewhere around 20 billion. So that will have an enormous impact on strengthening and starting to track that overall master plan towards 2035. Of course, from an OEM, a tier 1 and a tier 2 and 3, there are different challenges. From an ownership point of view, we need to look at black ownership, and we are already quite far along the line of agreeing with government to a equity equivalence model and the establishment of an automotive industry transformation fund. And there are many tier 1 suppliers that are already applying to participate in that as well. From a funding point of view, the transformation fund and the APDP phase 2 will support a lot of that growth. But I want to just focus for a second on skills development, because this is a key issue. There's support from the OEMs to tier 1 suppliers in skill development, but very little that trickles down to tier 2 and 3. And that's where, as a country or as an industry, we'll have the big challenge. How do we drive and develop those skills to be able to support this master plan? And how do we drive and develop that value chain for the tier 2 and 3 suppliers as well? If we think about how this all fits together, the master plan really is fixed on how do we become globally competitive. And as I mentioned before, without that, we won't be able to participate in the global supply chain, and we won't be able to grow our export volumes. And so the master plan pillars support that in terms of local market optimization, regional markets development through trade agreements in Africa, localization, and then technology investments. And all of that will support transformation. From a volume point of view, we'll also see an increase of 24% in our total production volume, which is very, very close to what the master plan had targeted, increasing from around 600,000 to over 800,000 units a year by 2023. But we have some interesting challenges from a localization point of view. If we just think about the value of a vehicle and how that's made up, there are significant changes that are going to take place over the coming years. We often think that drivetrain is the key component to value creation for the future, but as a portion, that's going to drop from around 52% to 25% over the next 10 to 15 years. The interior is going to change slightly. A lot of it's because of material changes. If we look at all the press parts, that's where a lot of our industry is focused. As a portion of the value of the vehicle, that's actually going to decline. Exterior, that's our hang-on parts, bumpers, light fittings, wheels, etc., is going to decline. Suspension is going to remain largely the same, although we do feel that there will be raw material changes there. But the big game changer is electric. We think that the electric is just around the drivetrain. It's not. It's around the connected portion. It's around the safety technology that I referred to. It's about the communication aspects within the vehicle. And that's going to dramatically change from around 10% in the 1990s to where it is now, 15%, all the way up to 46%. And if we don't substantially change the way we think about these technologies, we are going to naturally, over time, actually have a decrease in localization. And so we need to look at how do we deepen that value chain, and also how do we widen by bringing in new technologies. And I just want to give you a very practical example. If you think about a door assembly, we used to have around 90% local content in a door assembly. We can segment that into pure local. Some is a combination of local and imported, and some is pure imported. We now have dropped down to around 40%. Simply because the technologies have changed, the materials have changed, it's not viable with small volumes to localize, and so we're in a situation where simple door assembly, and if you read through some of those aspects, is now as low as 40%. So we have a challenge on our hands, and we need to face that quite directly. We have a business culture in Toyota where we really value and reward what we refer to as problem awareness, where people are honest and direct about the assessment of the root cause of the problem. And this is one area where we need to face those facts, and we need to discuss this openly so that we can collaborate to address and solve the problems. However, despite the fact that there are going to be those changes, we are confident that over the next 5 years, there's going to be a significant increase in the local content per vehicle manufactured in South Africa all the way through to 2023. If you combine that with the volume increase, we'll be contributing an additional 12.6 billion rand into the South African economy every year. That's an enormous contribution and can really have a big impact. And the opportunities beyond that are still significant. From an employment point of view, we're not as large as agriculture. We have a higher employment base than mining, but the important aspect is that our skill base is very high. So as an automotive industry, we can have a catalytic impact on other manufacturing businesses. We employ highly skilled people. Our percentage is very high, and that can have a benefit to other manufacturing industries in the country as well. From a Toyota perspective, I want to talk a little bit about the skills development, because this is a key aspect to us achieving this vision. And we've, for many decades, right back to Dr. Albert Wessels, have had a big focus on training, development, and skill development. So for manufacturing, we have learnership programs, maintenance artisan programs, and also graduate trainee intakes. We then have leadership development programs, intercompany transfers, where we transfer people to overseas assignments and then bring them back, and global study team assignments where our production members go and work on plants outside of the country. And then we look at advanced management as well. So to give you some examples, we recruit on an annual basis around 210 learners. We develop them, we take them out of matric, and we take them through a production learnership before they go onto the line. As they develop through their careers, they become team leaders, and we're in a program now where we send team leaders to Japan. They work on the most advanced and stringent manufacturing plants in Japan, namely Lexus, and they do extremely well. We often talk in South Africa about the skills gap and about the availability of skills, but I think as business, it's really up to us to take the young people and take them through almost a work-hardening environment where they can transition from the academic learning to becoming effective in business. And I'm very proud and very excited about the young people that I see joining our company every year. We get very, very good feedback globally about their performance. The graduate trainee program is also very important. We recruit from all over South Africa, including the University of Pretoria. And we are, again, very encouraged by the attitude, the skill levels, the abilities, and we have a structured way of developing those individuals through our programs. Some of them have been overseas and working in Europe, and we've had very, very good feedback about their capabilities. In fact, sometimes we have to work quite hard to get them back. So I think that's a good sign. We have also got a very interesting collaboration through the University of Pretoria and GIBS, being the Gordon Institute of Business Leadership. in the formation of the Toyota Vessels Institute of Manufacturing Studies. We established this late last year, and we had our first intake earlier this year. And the facility is focused on creating an appeal and a drive and an excitement in manufacturing. And so we offer an MBA that's conferred by Gibbs that specializes in manufacturing. And we're trying in that way to make a big contribution. Toyota obviously has tremendous global expertise in manufacturing, and we want to share that, also the practical insights, to create MBA programs, special short courses, and try and support not just the auto industry, but manufacturing and industrialization in general. I talked about the fact that we need to develop tier 2 and 3 suppliers, the fact that there were funds available, but who's going to lead and manage those? And so we've just announced the fact that we have established a 70 million rand endowment fund that will be funding 90% of the costs for participating in this MBA program. And we'd like those people to then flow into starting their own businesses and starting to drive industrialization in South Africa. We also have short courses specializing in future manufacturing, green manufacturing, Africa trade, which is so important for us, lean operations, and of course lean supply chain management, which is a Toyota hallmark. From a transformation and employment point of view, we will see a significant increase in employment, not at the OEMs, but in the supply base. And after what I've discussed, it becomes clear that that's where the big employment opportunity is going to be. We will employ an additional 16,000 people. If you take the multiplier effect, that'll equate to around 48,000. Youth and female portion of that will increase quite significantly. So what can we contribute as an automotive industry? Additional localization of around 12 billion a year, additional employment of 16,000 in the next 5 years. By 2035, we'll be able to support the creation of over 500 tier 2 and 3 businesses, and 130 of those will be black owned. I want to put this in perspective to answer the question. If we follow this path and generate over 12 billion rand a year, we'll be able to grow the total manufacturing portion, not just automotive, by between 2.5% and 3% and 5% alone, and that's a conservative estimate. That means that manufacturing will grow faster than services and other industries, and this will turn the tide. And I think the future beyond this is really quite significant. Of course, there are challenges, policy, stability, and bureaucracy. We're making very good headway in that area. We need to look at how we can beneficiate raw materials. A lot has been discussed about that, but we need to take concrete action. Skills transfer and development, as I mentioned to our tier 2 and 3 suppliers. We need to encourage more foreign direct investment, and we need to collaborate amongst the OEMs and across the brands, and also with other industries. There are lots of electronic industries being established in South Africa, and we can together benefit from that. So can the South African automotive industry contribute to the reindustrialization of our country? I believe it can, and I believe it can make a significant impact if we have the right attitude and the right approach, and we don't just wait, but we take decisive action together. We have a robust master plan. We have the capacity to accelerate the contribution. We have a relatively high multiplier effect, and we have a very strong need and desire to make a difference and introduce the opportunities for us to beneficiate material. And of course, we have a very strong, positive contribution to the balance of trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks for the inspiring presentation. So Andrew has agreed to take a few questions, so if you can please put your hand up, and there's a button on your speakerphone. If you press the button, then the light will come on, and then so we can get your question on the audio streaming as well. Any questions?
Thank Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Just one question which wasn't clear to me in terms of the growth. Where do you see that? Is it domestic consumption? And what sort of vehicles do you see the growth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we see a couple of different factors. The one is the South African market has been declining as a market for the last 5 years. And unfortunately, our forecast for 2020 is a further decline. But we'd see it turning and growing from 2020 onwards towards 2023, which is our 5-year business plan. However, the biggest contributor is going to be on export. We're still very reliant on exporting into Europe and other developed markets, and that will continue to grow. And we think that we reached the bottom of the cycle for our exports into Africa last year. Initially, we had, as a Toyota South Africa, an increase of around 30% in orders into Africa. Unfortunately, as the year went on, that started to diminish, but it's certainly a lot better base than we saw in 2018. So it'll be very much Africa-driven. To answer your questions about the type of products, of course, each OEM has a slightly different strategy in those products. But certainly in the next 5 years, although they're not sharing with us their specific model lineup, it's going to be a continuation of the models that we have. Pickup buckies, premium vehicles, and of course some passenger vehicles, using very similar technology to what we have at the moment.
Hi there. Does the forecast incorporate things like a downgrade? I know it's a horrible prospect, but should something like that take place, how would your forecast for potential growth be affected? Could things turn out even better in the case of such a forecast because of increased exports due to exchange rate changes? I don't know what such a prospect would mean for the future of the auto industry.
So a large portion of our volume on the export market is derived from the development of those country markets themselves. And certainly if our costs were to go down, we wouldn't see a dramatic increase in volumes. However, it is important that we stay competitive because it defines future investments in follow-on models. We've obviously taken a number of different scenarios on what could happen, and I believe that if you consider the conditions on commodity prices, exchange rate volatility, what's happening both from a political, social point of view in Africa and South Africa, it's a fairly conservative model. There are some upsides that we could also benefit from, but a downgrade would have a big impact on the South African consumer base. And around 40% of our total volume is based on that. So we'd see some impact from that point of view.
Kirby from GSTM. I've got two questions. I'll ask them simultaneously. The first one, the opportunity for export in terms of a knockdown facility for the auto industry in South Africa. And I'm talking about all the auto, not only Toyota, and then export on that basis. And the second question is about the PPGI. I would like to know what you think the success, the magic sauce was what you had on your PPGI in the automotive industry. I'm involved in the construction industry on PPGI, and it's a nightmare.
Okay. I think the first one is around what is the potential for KD exports into Africa. I can assure you it's very high. What is happening in Africa is many countries are looking at how they can industrialize their countries. They have balance of payment challenges, they have forex challenges, and vehicles are obviously an important contributor to that. And they're looking at how can they stimulate industrialization using the motor industry as a catalyst. And of course, with our dominant position in South Africa, looking at South Africa to say, can you support that? And so we have agreed as an organization. In fact, we created an organization called the AAAM, which is the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. And we have broadly agreed to support that strategy. We have to be careful because not every country in South Africa can suddenly manufacture vehicles, because all we'd end up seeing is a decline in our own manufacturing base. But there is a lot of sense to taking the majority of the value addition, which is in the press, paint and weld processes, retaining that in South Africa, shipping the KD kits to other countries where the assembly is done. Kenya is doing that, Ghana is doing that, Nigeria's been talking about it, but I think that'll take a lot longer because of their internal political situation. There's already discussions with Ethiopia, and of course in North Africa there are a couple of countries, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, all looking at creating some form of automotive industry. And we need to be quite proactive in supporting that, not just from a KD kit point of view, but also in terms of supporting them from a skill point of view. And how do we also create a supply base from South Africa that can support those manufacturing operations in those countries as well. If we don't do it, those kits will simply come from Thailand, Turkey, other markets, and we lose out. And so certainly our vision as Toyota, and it's I think similar for other OEM brands, is that we need to be the hub for manufacturing in Africa and make sure that we really drive and sustain that. Your second question around PPGI, I was obviously a part of that and saw the interesting discussions from a construction point of view as well. We have been fairly successful through the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, which is now called, to take some of those disenablers or inhibitors and start to address those. And of course, I think it's been different for each of the ministries. But I do sense in government a high level of urgency to work with business and to overcome some of those issues. You've all heard of the phrase, don't waste a good crisis. I think this is an opportunity where I do perceive that there's a lot of people listening and the intent to move much faster. And so I think if we do it in a constructive way, we can do it. Of course, I understand the construction issues are quite deep, but I think overall the PPGI has been successful.
Last question.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My question is with regards to technology. As you mentioned that the manufacturing or assembly of a car door is that now it was 90% and now it's 40%. So how do you consolidate that with your current local suppliers with regards to moving into the new technology era, which is intelligent manufacturing? And how will you consolidate it with the current ones and the new upcoming local suppliers? How will you be able to make sure that it's how can I put this? How can you? Yes.
I think that's a very complex discussion, and there's some big challenges there. But I think to try and crystallize it into the components, on the one hand, we don't have the volume to be able to justify some of that localization of that new technology. So we have to collaborate across the different competitors to generate that scale. And that's what we're starting to do in having those discussions. Each OEM will find it difficult, but if we collaborate together, we can create that volume. On the other hand, the capital investment is one of the key disincentivizers. And so we need to find ways of funding and financing that so it can make sense for us as a country. So we see the bigger picture and we drive that. And the third one is, how do we make it attractive for foreign direct investments? How do we make it attractive for those multinationals in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, to come to South Africa to set up that operation in an easy way, and so that they can benefit us. And so we're looking at creating automotive supplier parks, SEZ environments, with a lot of support from both provincial and national government, and of course the manufacturers to facilitate that. I think those are the three key elements.
So how will you be, contributing to the new auto city that they'll be developing in Tshwane, Roslyn? How will that play?
So we won't be contributing to that, but we will be setting up our own. So we will have an automotive supply park down in Durban, and we'll be facilitating manufacturing in KwaZulu-Natal at the same time.
I think I just want, knowing, and I think you highlight the point around high unemployment in South Africa, right? So I would be interested to hear what type of backward linkages that particularly focuses on labor-intensive opportunities within the automotive sector. I understand that this is a sector that is driven by technology, but certainly there are areas where you could actually target, where there's you could actually attract people with limited skills, right? That's the first issue. I think the second issue I would have liked you to reflect on is what makes your supplier development model different going to 2035 versus what, because then in essence that's how you're able to gauge that there was a frank, candid conversation in terms of what are the weaknesses. I think you highlight the point on the skills intervention. I think it's quite clear, and you can already see exactly who you're targeting. But then what happens to, how do you reflect and say this makes this model of supply development makes it different, and in fact you're going to be able to do both localization of South Africa, but I also see the localization of both SADC region and the African continent.
Okay, so I think structurally, from an employment point of view, and the absorption of lower skilled people is quite important. And the mechanism to do that is to try and generate more locally based, what we refer to as tier 2 and 3 suppliers. They don't need those global technology and license agreements. They don't need to conform to the very stringent quality requirements from manufacturers, OEMs, because we don't allow a supplier to build up stock and decide when they want to deliver it to us. We have just-in-time, in-sequence supply. If they stop supplying, we stop production 4 hours later. However, with a tier 2 and a 3 supplier that is supplying subcomponents into their tier 1 supplier, they don't have those stringent requirements, and the skill levels are also lower. And so we have a very specific strategy through the creation of the Transformation Fund, through the skills development, through the push on localization to create those job opportunities. And that's where the majority of the transformation employment opportunities are going to be. And if we don't do that, we won't be able to counterbalance the fourth industrial revolution. So we're going to lose some skill base in some areas, but that's where we're going to be able to grow it. And I think that's the concrete plan we have that I think can work. Your second question was around our supply-based development aspect. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question specifically, but the big challenge I do think we have is people. We can create the funding, we can create the technology, we can take the off-take agreements in terms of demand, but the people that are interested in working in those manufacturing operations on a daily basis, getting their hands dirty, driving those organizations, we don't need passive investors that sit back and say, well, this is now a black-owned company just because I happen to have put some cash into it. That doesn't achieve anything, quite frankly. We need people who are passionate about manufacturing, that want to develop their own businesses, and so our challenge is, where are those people going to come from? My assertion is actually they need to come from our own organizations. So we as Toyota South Africa need to employ those people, grow, develop them, give them international assignments, give them opportunities to really understand, and then agree that they're going to move out and start businesses in the supply chain. That's the investment we need to make. It might sound like it's not a good investment, but it's a good investment. And we need to get that way of thinking to permeate across the industry, not just automotive, but in manufacturing. Because those people don't exist, right? We need to drive them and develop them and create that skill and leadership capacity.
Thanks. I'll ask Dr. Govan to close the event. You can ask the questions offline, sir, during thanks. You can do it after drinks, sir, because we're running a bit late now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My role this evening is to thank Mr. Kirby for his wonderful presentation this evening. I represent the South African Academy of Engineering, and as a background, the Hendrik van der Bijl Memorial Lecture, which is delivered annually by a leading personality, is arranged under the auspices of the South African Academy of Engineering and the University of Pretoria. So we invited, more than 2 years ago, Mr. Kirby to come and give us, present the lecture so we could hear his perspective of where we are in South Africa from the point of view of his sector, the automotive sector. But because of his busy schedules, it's taken a while. In fact, at one stage, when I heard that this would coincide with the Rugby World Cup, I just wondered whether you were interested in rugby or whether you had bought the tickets yet. So I'm very pleased that you made it this evening. We're very honored. I was privileged to attend the President Ramaphosa's initial investment conference last year, and also observed the prominent role that leadership role that you played, and which was highly acknowledged from the point of view of what's possible for South Africa. So thank you for all the insights that you've given from where we are as a country, the challenges that we face, and but it's always great to hear that there are positive prospects if everything falls into place, and that as an engineer you've done such a tremendous job in positioning your sector in this way for our country. Thank you. Thank you for this, and I need to give you the small gift for this. We're grateful for the partnership that we have with the University of Pretoria, which has served us very well. I want to thank the Vice Principal, Professor Straw, for coming this evening and for sharing the information, the prospects for this large and very significant university in Gauteng, and especially from the point of view of engineering. We know big strides are being made, including the Dean of Engineering, Prof. Maharaj. We're always watching of all the progress that's being made. Thank you for your sharing this evening. I also want to thank all the university staff involved in arrangements for this evening. Finally, I wish to thank my colleagues within the South African Academy of Engineering, some of them in the Western Cape, and also locally here. I want to thank also Ms. Helene, our secretary, for making sure that everything that needed to be done for this evening to be a success, it was done. So thank you very much. We are all invited to spend more time in the foyer and enjoy the drinks and the catering that's been provided for us. Thank you all for listening.